Welcome to tonight's Stephen Kellen lecture at the American Academy in Berlin. We are happy that our partner Siedler Verlag, in particular Markus Isager down here, has made tonight's event possible. Thank you for this. And we'd like to continue with a very interesting program tonight. I'm particularly happy that Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning speaker tonight, will first of all be introduced here by a former student. That's always a good thing. If you find a student who's willing to introduce you, you've made so many things right, and he's done so many things right. After that, Joseph Stiglitz will step up here and will be interviewed by Thorsten Rieke from the Handelsblatt. They'll both be entering, if you like, into a debate for about 40 minutes, I suppose, and after that, they both agreed to take questions. And if we're lucky, they will both answer them. So after those question and answer sessions, you're all invited to step outside for a drink and to continue the discussion and the debate with anybody you would always wanted to talk to. We've prepared food and drinks, and so we can all, if you like, continue with thoughts and ideas about the euro and the common currency. I will say no more, because now I'm particularly happy that Heinrich von Portatius, your former student, will step up here and introduce you, Joseph Stiglitz. Thank you so much.
So, can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. So it is, of course, quite a daunting task to introduce someone of your stature and not miss out on a lot of things. So I'm going to reduce that part to a few great points. You are Nobel laureate, Clark Medal winner. You have several economic models named after you. You have been teaching at the most prestigious universities, and I read that you hold more than 40 honorary degrees. That is quite something. So one could say as an academic you have achieved everything, but you probably wouldn't say so. What makes you so different from a lot of academics is that you are never content with just describing the world around us, but that you try to offer new approaches on how to solve these very difficult issues. And you do this with, remarkable energy and integrity. You have served your government as chief economic advisor in the Clinton administration. Subsequently, you stirred up the World Bank as chief economist, and that had wider repercussions. You have then founded the Initiative for Political Dialogue at Columbia University, and I read that you're currently the fourth most cited economist. So I wonder who the other three are, but Adam Smith. Yeah. And then, kind of on the side, you're also the senior advisor to a lot of governments and global institutions, so to round it off. To address a wider audience, you have chosen to simplify complex economic problems, and with books like Free Fall and The Price of Inequality, which I have read and I think mostly understood, which cannot be said for all your books. You try to bring these questions to everyone's mind, which is a great thing. And most importantly, all your work is, of course, based on meticulous scientific research and data. So, I was a student of yours at Columbia Business School in the heady days of 2008 and 2009. And before enrolling in your class, somebody actually warned me that you're a dangerous liberal. So, instead, I found you to be a beacon of clarity when the world around us was collapsing. Together with your colleague Bruce Greenwald, you taught us a class on globalization, which offered great perspectives on the world around us and what was actually happening at that moment, and we learned to look a bit further. So free market capitalism and efficient market hypothesis as a mantra had been preached for decades by many economists, and Professor Stiglitz had actually dubbed these believers in a world without checks and balances as free market fundamentalists. So when the free market nirvana collapsed around us, rather than saying, "I told you so," like so many doomsayers, You opened our eyes towards global economic and social imbalances and how these affect our daily lives much more than we generally think. So you always address the uncomfortable issues, but you're also a great optimist. We just talked about that. So when I read that you're turning now your attention on the euro, having previously advised the Greek government and having called the austerity measures a suicide pact, I certainly had mixed feelings. Being a historian by training, I have always been a great admirer of and a firm believer in the EU. However, the common currency has posed severe problems for the European project, and most of us have difficulties to grasp the political and economic complexities. Europe is in need of a better understanding of what is holding this market together and what the threats are. So I'm grateful that a great mind like yours will hopefully mitigate this information asymmetry on behalf of the audience and address the uncomfortable questions which we will need to face. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. What I'm going to try to do this evening is just give about a 10-15 minute summary, and then we'll have a discussion. So obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover most of the points. Maybe I should begin with a question I get asked. An obvious question is, what is an American doing writing about the euro? Doesn't America have enough problems of its own to occupy us? And the answer is yes, we do have much worse problems. But there are a couple of reasons, obviously, that we live in a globally integrated world, and what happens in Europe affects everybody. Affects us in the United States, affects the world, and. For me, it's particularly important because a lot of the issues that I've been concerned about, writing about for a long time, the course, some of the issues we talked about in the course that you mentioned, are global issues like climate change, issues like global human rights, and Europe has been the strongest voice on most of those issues. And if Europe is preoccupied with some problems in the euro, problems that it shouldn't have to, where things should be working better. Obviously, it doesn't have the energy to address these really other fundamental issues, and its voice isn't going to be heard as loudly as it should. Finally, I should say that economists love experiments, and we can't do experiments very often. There aren't many, and this is a natural experiment. Nobody in their right mind would have undertaken this experiment. That was off the record. But now that you've done that experiment, it is really very interesting to see how it is unfolding and to try to understand what is going on. There is a big debate about what is going on among economists. There is a general consensus that things are not going well, and I think among most people. The debate is focused around between two sections. One, there's one view that says it's policy mistakes. The other view that I'm going to try to articulate very briefly is that it's the structure of the Eurozone, that it was flawed at birth, and that not even a genius as a policymaker would have been able to make it work without breaking the rules themselves, without violating some of the underlying rules that constituted the structure of the Eurozone. Of course, there were very bad policy mistakes, and I'll describe some of them very briefly. But it is the basic construction of the Eurozone, of the euro, that was at fault. Now, to understand the euro, one has to understand that it arose, it was constructed at a particular moment of history with the strongest of the most positive of motives, aspirations of trying to bring Europe closer together, and the idea that a single currency would help, would bring prosperity, and that prosperity would then further the objectives of economic and political integration. And there would be then a virtuous circle that as things worked out better, people would become more committed to the European project, and it would then, as I say, be a virtuous circle. It was a political project, though, not an economic one, and one in which many economists were skeptical about whether the conditions that were necessary to make a common currency, a single currency, work among a set of diverse countries would be able to work. And while it was a political project, the politics weren't strong enough to create the kinds of institutions that would enable it to work well. And in fact, if I have time, I'll try to describe. The failures were actually sufficiently great that while they understood that in order to make it work, there would have to be a convergence of the countries, and that was part of the objective, that if the single currency could help promote that convergence, actually they created a diverging system. It's played out very strongly that way. The richer countries have gotten richer, and the poorer countries have gotten poorer. The gaps between the rich and the poor have gotten greater. And the result of this is that the euro has not promoted prosperity. I'll give you some charts very, very quickly to show that. So not only has it not promoted prosperity, but because it hasn't promoted prosperity, because it's led to this divergence, it actually has resulted in undermining political solidarity. And that, of course, has meant that the idea that some people had at the beginning, that yes, they knew that it was not a completed project, but over time it would be completed. And the hope was that the solidarity that was created over time would enable that to happen. In fact, as things have gotten more divided, it's become more and more difficult to finish the project. To understand what the construction at that moment, the flaws at birth, one has to understand the particular moment in history when the euro was created, the Maastricht Convention in 1992. And this is, history matters. And a thought experiment is what would have happened if it had been created somewhat later. 1992 was a moment after the collapse of the Iron Curtain that was wrongly viewed as a victory of the market economy. I say wrongly because it was not the victory of the market, it was the defeat of the communists. It was a system that couldn't work. So many people interpreted it, though, it was evidence that the market was invincible and that markets worked really well. But as I say, really evidence is that communism really worked very badly. So there was at that moment a kind of market euphoria. That market euphoria led to the view that as long as government didn't mess up things, as long as governments created the right context, the market would solve most problems. Not everything, but would solve most problems. So the idea got reflected in the fact that if governments kept deficits low, debts low relative to their GDP, if monetary authorities kept inflation low, then the private sector would take care of the rest. In fact, they call these ideas the convergence criteria. Sometimes I'm asked, where did the number 3% debt GDP come from? It was picked out of the thin air. There was no economic theory. Where did 60% come from? Picked out of the thin air. Where did a 2% inflation target come from? Picked out of the thin air. Most of these things, there was very little economic support for. Take the debt GDP ratio. There was a famous story of Ken Rogoff and his colleague Carmen Reinhardt wrote an article in which they said there is some critical number. If debt GDP ratio got above that number, growth slowed down. But that number was 80–90%. But then a student at UMass Amherst, and this is really, for those, any students here, it's a good story. They said, I want to verify that their calculations were right. And they asked for the data, and originally they didn't get it, but finally they got the data. And they reran their regressions, and they discovered that there was a spreadsheet mistake. And then they discovered that there is no magic number like 80 or 90%. In fact, I often think anecdotes are more telling than the statistical regressions. The United States at the end of World War II had a debt GDP ratio of 130%. And how did we respond to that high debt GDP ratio? We didn't respond by saying austerity. What we said is, let's grow the economy. Because if we grow our economy, our GDP, our income will grow, and debt relative to our income will come down. And that's exactly what we did. And so we said to every student who had fought, every young person who had fought in the war, which was basically every male and a lot of women, you could get as much education in the best and most expensive schools as you want. You go to 12 years at Harvard, if you can get in. And then we had a massive highway program, build highways from one end of the country to another. And then we had a science program, a technology program, countering Sputnik. And all of these succeeded in bringing the debt GDP ratio down to 45% of debt to GDP. So it wasn't through austerity that we got things under control. It was through spending. And with spending, investment in our people and in our economy. Well, that notion that, as I said, at that particular moment, that if government made sure it didn't make these mistakes, the markets would take care of the rest. If the euro had been founded a few years later, nobody would have believed that. Because by 1997-98, when I was chief economist of the World Bank, we'd already seen the East Asia crisis. The East Asia crisis was a crisis among countries which had low inflation, no deficits, and very low debt. And yet they went into crisis. And so we then knew that just keeping inflation low, keeping deficits and debts low was not a guarantee that things would work out well. And then, of course, by 2008, we knew that leaving it to the markets was not a good thing, because we left things to the financial markets a little too much, and we had the 2008 financial crisis. As it turned out, the lessons of East Asia were and would have been relevant for Europe, because Ireland and Spain, two of the countries that are among the list of crisis countries, had surpluses before the crisis and had very, very low deficit to GDP ratio, debt to GDP ratios. The crisis caused their deficits, and the crisis caused their debt GDP ratios to skyrocket. So we got the causality wrong. It wasn't the deficit that caused the crisis caused the deficit. And so focusing on the deficit isn't going to prevent another crisis and isn't going to get them out of the current malaise in which they're in. Well, let me try to explain very briefly why it is that the creation of the single currency has had such adverse effect on the economy of Europe. And let me just, to show you what I mean, let me just give you a few graphs here. Everybody understood that the real test of the euro wasn't going to be whether it would be accepted. You know, in 2003, 4, 5, people were saying, look, the euro is a success because it's being accepted. People are using it. And the economist's response was, that's not the test of a currency area. The test of a currency area is how it will respond to a crisis. Because when you had a single currency, what you had done was to take away two of the most important mechanisms for adjustment, exchange rate and interest rates, and they hadn't put anything in their place. In fact, they had tied their hands even further by limiting the ability to have deficits. And, you know, just a little bit of a digression, when I was on the Council of Economic Advisors, there were some people in the opposite party who had tried to pass a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution to say that we couldn't have deficits, to limit our ability to have deficits. And we were on target to have a surplus. So you might say, well, you know, why oppose this constitutional amendment? Well, we knew that we were able to manage the economy well. And it was the greatest period of our prosperity. And we won't say who should get credit for it, but it was a period of great prosperity. But we also knew that there are shocks that you cannot foresee, and you cannot predict where they're going to come from. And we knew that there might be a future president that wouldn't be able to manage the economy so well, as turned out to be the case. So we very strongly opposed that constitutional amendment, and I think now both parties agree that that was a good thing. Because if we hadn't had that flexibility in the 2008 crisis, we would have gone into a deep downturn. Well, so that's the situation. That was the point, that a single currency had taken away these means of adjustment. And you see the real test of the euro was in the crisis of 2008. Now, it was unfortunate for Europe that your first test was such a big test. You know, if luck had been with you, maybe you would have had a smaller test and you could have developed your institutions over time, and things would have developed more slowly and more gradually, and things would have worked out. But history doesn't always give you those choices. So the 2008, you had the worst crisis in 80 years. And it came from across the Atlantic. You can blame us. But you have to, in a world of globalization, you have to take what you face. So what you see here is that by 2015, real GDP was just recovering to its earlier levels. And with many countries, of course, and particularly the countries in crisis, having a lower GDP than before the crisis. But the real thing to understand is that for the countries that are in crisis, and even for countries like Italy that are not officially in crisis, the economic downturn is greater than the Great Depression. So for people living in these countries, what they are experiencing is worse than what people experienced in the Great Depression. And I know it's hard for people living in Germany, where there's been this high level of prosperity, to understand how bad things have been in some of the other countries. Of course, the worst of these countries is Greece, with a 25% decrease in real GDP. One way of seeing most dramatically the difference is between this chart here contrasting the United States and Europe, where in both of these I drew a trend line of where growth was, the economy was between 1980 and 2000. And what you see in the case, both countries are, roughly similar trend lines. Not great growth, but not bad. What you see in the case of Euro, and interesting, is that after the construction of the start of the Euro, there wasn't any burst of growth. But what you see is dramatically is what happened with the crisis of 2008. And that is that growth, the green dotted line is what the actual experience has been. The red line is what it would have been if growth had continued as it was. And in both cases, you see a huge gap, neither performing well. But finally, what you see is the United States is beginning to recover. It's an anemic recovery, but it's a recovery. But what you see in the case of Europe is a continuation of this kind of stagnation. Of course, GDP is one thing, but really what affects many people is the unemployment rate, whether they can get a job. And in the crisis countries, the unemployment rate has been 25%. Spain is celebrating the fact that the crisis is over. Unemployment is down to only 1 out of 5 people out of a job. And Greece is now celebrating that finally their youth unemployment is down to 49%. So less than 1 out of 2 people are out of a job, young people are out of a job. But that's only because so many of them have left Greece. And of course, for the families, and I have lots of friends in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, for the families who see their children go to Australia or Brazil or Latin America, they know that they probably won't return. Especially as the crisis goes on year after year. They're going to get married, they're going to get settled. And what this means is the prospects of these countries ever catching up to where they would have been or even growing is becoming more and more dismal. So it's not only the GDP, the output today is being devastated, it's actually the future of their growth. Well, what I try to emphasize is not only that these are questions about the structure of the Eurozone, that it had taken away these means of adjustment. It also created a diverging system. And let me just very briefly describe one example of how it diverged. In the book, I describe several ways in which it diverged. Go back to 2008-9, after the crisis, which originated, as I say, in the United States. Normally, what would you think? A country that has had such bad financial market regulation, such bad macroeconomic management, that you have this global crisis, is that a place where you would think money would rush to that country? Well, normally we would say, no, you would be rushing out of that country. What happened in 2000, after the Lehman Brothers collapse, the end of 2008 and beginning of 2009? Actually, money went to the United States. Was it because the United States banks had proven that they knew how to manage risk stupendously? That was a rhetorical question. And the answer was no, they had not proven themselves, nor had our country proven itself good at macro management. Why they came was very simple, and it illustrated. I was on a conference call right after Lehman Brothers collapsed with Obama and other, who is a presidential candidate. It was right before it was before the election, and the Democratic Party was trying to formulate their response to the crisis. And what were we going to say to the proposals of the Bush administration for a bailout? And Bush had proposed a $700 billion bailout. And most of the people, almost all of the people on the conference call were bankers, and their first response was, why only $700 billion? And the answer was, $1 trillion sounded too big politically. But don't worry, if you need more, you'll get it. So the point was, why did money come to the United States? Because our government had shown that we had deep pockets and we were going to give it to support our banks, and that gave comfort to people putting their money into the United States. Well, you ask yourself, you have your money in a Spanish bank account and you know that Spain is weak. Would you keep your money in Spain, or would you want to move it to some place where the government is somewhat stronger? Well, it's quite obvious. That was also a rhetorical question. It's actually remarkable that money didn't move out as fast as economists would have predicted it moved out. But anyway, money did move out. But what happens when money moves out of the banking system? The banks can't lend, and that means businesses contract and businesses get weaker. And that means there's less tax revenue, the government gets weaker, the banks get weaker, and it's a downward vicious circle. So what you have is this process as the weak countries start getting weaker because money flows from the weak to the strong, and the strong countries get stronger. That's an example of a divergent process that was built in to the system from the beginning. As long as you didn't have common deposit insurance, money would be leaving the weakest countries and going towards the strongest. If you had a common deposit insurance, then that would not happen. But you didn't have that as part of the institutions at the creation of the euro. It's one of the reasons why America has a single currency working in 50 diverse states, but we have common deposit insurance. Well, you might have thought that since you had taken away the exchange rate as a mechanism of adjustment, they would have focused not on fiscal policy, fiscal deficits, but current account deficits. That would be the natural thing, but they didn't focus on current account deficits. Somehow they thought markets would take care of everything. And of course, in the end, they didn't, and there wound up to be large current account deficits. If we have time, we can come back to that. What I want to go on to, though, is talk about, yes, the core problem is the structure, and policymakers could not have succeeded without violating one or the other of the strictures of the Eurozone. But policies did make things worse. Two aspects of the policies that have gotten a lot of attention. The first, of course, is the austerity, and I'm not going to say anything more about it. I've already given the basic message. But the other is the structural policies, structural reforms. Now, of course, every country needs a structural reform. I mean, United States, I know my country better. United States needs big structural reforms in our healthcare system. We spend 17% of GDP on healthcare, and we get the worst healthcare performance, much worse than other advanced countries, much worse than the countries in Europe. I could go through many sectors in our economy where we badly need structural reform. And obviously, many of the countries in the periphery of Europe need structural reform. But it wasn't like in 2008, their structure suddenly turned bad. Or in 2000 or 1992. There wasn't a sudden disease that swept across the southern countries of laziness or rigidity, rigor mortis or something. It wasn't a disease that spread across. Many of these countries had actually faster economic growth than the average of Europe before 2008 or before 2000 or before 1992. Many of these countries have faster productivity increases. So you don't have a good structure, the citizens of the country suffer. They suffer from having lower standards of living, and hopefully they'll look around their neighbors and say, why do we suffer from lower standards of living when our neighbors have a higher standard of living and that they use a democratic political process to put pressure on their governments to reform and to do something about the structure of their economy. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. That you see that you're not performing well and you put pressure for change. None of these countries, though, ever had in recent history a downturn of the magnitude that they are experiencing now. They didn't have 49, 55, 60% youth unemployment. They didn't have the kinds of output gaps, the kinds of stagnation that they've experiencing. So what is the answer? I think it has to do mostly with the structure of the Eurozone. And it's that, so the reform that is needed is not the structure of the individual countries, but the structure of the Eurozone itself. And that's really the reform that is critical. But what were some of the structural reforms that the Eurozone asked for? Well, actually, some of these were actually bizarre, almost, is the only word to, you try to get this picture. Greece is going into a deep depression. Youth unemployment at that point was going up to 60-some%. And what is the Troika debating, the Eurozone leaders debating? How many days old should fresh milk be? Greek law said that fresh milk, to be labeled fresh milk, you can sell something as non-fresh milk. Fresh milk had to be 4 days old, not older than 4 days. And the Troika said, no, we want it to be changed as 10 days. And that became a major controversy. I won't go through what the hypotheses about some special interest in Northern Europe that may have played a role in wanting to sell unfresh milk as fresh milk to Southern Europe, and what effect that might have on the balance of payments and the current account deficit of Greece and employment in Greece. One of my friends who has an Italian, Luigi Zingales, who has a book out about, another book about the euro, and very critical of it, remarked after we had a discussion, this is a 10-day milk, that's not milk, that's yogurt. And other people said, we can't even sell it as yogurt at that age. But anyway, the point is that the structural reforms that were needed were not the ones that were focused upon. And each of the countries, there were differing structural reforms. And in Greece, for instance, there were some important structural reforms that Papandreou was trying to push through, having to do with the oligarchs and the interlinks between the oligarchs, the banks, and the media. And after the Troika forced him out of office when he wanted to call a referendum, which we now know is dangerous, they allowed those reforms to be undone. So that leads us to the question of where to go forward from here. The central message of the book is a very simple one, which is the euro in its current form is not sustainable. There either has to be more Europe or less Europe. And the better way of going forward is to have more Europe, to finish the project as people originally conceived of it, to create the institutions that would make a single currency work. And those institutions are not like inventing the wheel. They're not leaps into the unknown. They're not, from an economic point of view, even a big stretch. But you know better than I about the political climate and whether they are a bigger stretch than the politics would allow. So if you can't do that, the alternative is to try to think about some way of introducing more flexibility into the European system. Having 2 or 3 currency areas, some what I try to describe in the book are ways in which you can go from the current arrangement to systems of more flexibility, when I call it amicable divorce, a flexible euro. There are, fortunately, you can take advantage of the advances in technology, electronic banking, and so forth, to reduce the cost of moving to some of these more flexible systems. And so in the last part of the book, I try to describe how that might be done in ways that would reduce the cost. It won't be costless, but one of the things I think one has to understand is that the current system of muddling through is also very, very costly, especially to the countries in the periphery. And I don't mean just the countries in crisis. We're talking also about now Italy and France, the countries, so many of the countries in Europe that are experiencing near stagnation. So to me, it seems to me that it is important for Europe to begin to think about these issues. As I said in the beginning, how Europe does has a big effect on everybody in the world. There are some people who think that at a moment of crisis, Europe will do the right thing. That they talk about how much has already been accomplished, and at that moment of crisis, they will finish it. But that seems to me a dangerous approach, because moments of crisis are not the best time to think carefully about alternative institutional arrangements. And these are particularly complex alternative institutional arrangements. And so it seems to me much better to try to think through what are the consequences of alternative courses, and to realize that the current muddling through is a game of brinkmanship. And the danger of a brinkmanship is that there is a very high risk, one time or another, of going over the brink. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for showing up in such a big number. I think it's really worth it. Professor Stiglitz, thanks very much for your insights. I just noticed you managed to get around the elephant in the room, not mentioning Germany at all during your...
I did say Troika.
Right, which includes at least a couple of Germans. But more to the point, when you go through your book, when I actually read through it, it's very noticeable that it seems to be an angry book. You are angry at people. You use phrases like hypocrisy, dishonesty, and other things. So that leads to the question, why are you so angry, and why are you so angry now?
Oh, I think, as I said, the consequences of the failure of Europe to address these problems that I talked about are really palpable for large numbers of citizens. These are not just statistics. When economists talk about statistics, 60% youth unemployment. But those are lives of people who are being destroyed. And maybe it was that part of the period I was writing this book, I was spending time in Southern Europe, a lot of time in Spain and Greece, and picking up some of the vibes, and maybe I was too empathetic to what I was feeling at the time. But I don't feel ashamed. I think that when you see what it does to these lives, these are not just GDP numbers or unemployment numbers. These are people's lives that are being compromised.
I understand. When you write about austerity, you use the phrase medieval bloodletters. And I mean, this points a little bit into the direction of Germany. And I wonder, I mean, is there anything about the argument which is coming from, for example, from Wolfgang Schäuble, who insists that with all the help given to the crisis country, there is some kind of responsibility on the other side? Would you agree to that? Responsibility to actually do their homework?
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, as I said, the first responsibility of every country is itself and its political leaders. Okay, that's clear. The reason I use that metaphor of medieval bloodletting is that, to me, it conveys this notion of ideology versus science, because we know that medieval bloodletting was not a science. For those of you who don't know about, what they would do is they would take the blood out, and typically, and the theory, there was a well-defined theory, by the way, behind it, that your illnesses were bad humors that were in your blood, and they actually imported leeches to help take out the blood, because it just and usually, as you could figure out, after you let an awful lot of blood out, most patients didn't recover quickly. So what was their response? Typically the response was, we need to do more bloodletting. And what would happen is that as they did more bloodletting, most of the patients died. But every once in a while there was a miracle. And that's what they would remember. And now, of course, modern psychology tells us a lot about that. It's called confirmatory bias. There's a whole literature that you only remember the things that are consistent with your theory. So you forget about all those patients that died. It's that one guy who survived, and you said, see, if you only stuck, the other guy, if we stuck with it, then it works.
You talk about global imbalances, economic imbalances within the Eurozone. Germany is a pretty obvious case in this regard. The question is, what actually could Germany do to actually reduce those surpluses? When you look at real wages in Germany, they are up 2.3%. Private consumption is almost up 2%, the biggest increase in 15 years in Germany. So there is really economic activity at home going on here. So what else could Germany do to actually reduce those imbalances?
Well, the point you made, the biggest increase in 15 years was an important point. Let me try to explain for some of the non-economists what the issue here is. That the basic law in economics is that if some country exports more than it imports, some other country has to import more than it exports. Economists disagree about everything except this, that this is a basic law in economics. As long as our trade with Mars remains limited. So that means that if some country has a surplus persistent, and you say the right question is the one you asked, what can you do about it? If some country has a surplus persistently, that means some other countries have to have deficits. And deficits cause problems because they have to be financed, and markets often have this phenomenon called sudden stop. They can suddenly say, we don't want to finance that deficits, and then you have a crisis. Well, worries about these current account surpluses and how they destabilize the global economy were at the forefront of the discussions before 2008 in the global economy. That the worry that at that time China was the source of these big global surpluses, and the common wisdom was that world was at risk of a disorderly unwinding of these global surplus imbalances, which were related to China's surpluses and the deficits that were associated with it. Now, Germany and Northern Europe's surpluses are much larger than China's, and especially, as a percentage of GDP. So right now, Germany's is about twice that of China's. Just to get, and the United States and other countries berated China for its surpluses. Now, there is a discussion about good surpluses versus bad surpluses, and China does it in a bad way, and Germany does it in a good way, out of thrift and out of savings, as opposed to currency manipulation. So the question, though, and it's the right question, is what could Germany do to have reduced those surpluses? And at last, Germany is beginning to have more expansionary policies, but there's been a long period where you didn't get a minimum wage until quite recently. When every other country in Europe, not every other, but most of the other countries had no fiscal space to expand, you did have fiscal space to expand. So, when you're in a country that can't borrow, you can't spend. But Germany could. And that could have given a boost to the entire European economy. And in doing that, would have also reduced that spending would have reduced your surpluses. And that's the kind of thing. I don't think it would your surpluses would have disappeared, but they would have been brought down. But
that would mean Germany is on the right track at the moment.
I think
even the case that the surpluses are even bigger than a couple of years ago.
Well, I think there are many factors that determine surpluses at any moment, in one particular year, because it has to do with your trading partners and how well they're doing, and so there are a lot of things that happen on a year-by-year basis. But I think what you did of having a minimum wage, I think you should raise it, significantly, actually. So that would be a good thing. I think you should have a bigger, investment program. So you're on the right direction, but I think there's more room.
Okay. The other point, you talked about flexibility. More flexibility is needed within the Eurozone. But when it comes to devaluations, are the virtues of devaluations really sustainable? Meaning, are they just buying time for governments to do the hard work, the structural reforms? Or can you live with depreciations of your own currency over a long time and get more competitive?
Well, again, can I explain a little bit to some of there's a lot of economics in your question. So when in the old system, and one of the criticisms of the regime before 1992, before you created a single currency, there was one way in which you, when the economy is weak, you try to strengthen it, was to lower your exchange rate, and that would enable you to sell more exports and reduce your imports, and that would stimulate your economy. Now, there was always a danger that if you did it in a period where there was not excess capacity, the effect of that would be inflationary, and prices would start going up, and then the benefits that you got from the devaluation would erode fairly quickly. But if you're doing it in a period where you have 15%, 20% unemployment, you're not likely to get inflation. And more recent studies, have shown that what they call the pass-through, the extent to which devaluation gets passed through in increasing prices, has been much lower in the last 25 years than it was in earlier periods. So, so my answer is that it's not a panacea, but when you have the kinds of high unemployment that you have in many of the countries today, yes, it's very likely to work. Partly, we are not in an inflationary environment. You know, people are worried about deflation, and so while those concerns were really very strong 30 years ago, in recent evaluations, they've not played the role that they did in the discussions, as I say earlier.
Yeah. You also mentioned the need of a common deposit insurance for the Eurozone, which is not really popular here in Germany. In this case, you touch on a very fundamental problem of the Eurozone in several ways, because how do you separate accountability from economic success? So how do you deal with moral hazard in this case?
Yeah, so this is, you know, you didn't moral hazard, part of this debate, people always worry about moral hazard, which and some of my earlier research was on developing the theory of moral hazard, and that is, moral hazard is just a name for perverse incentives that when you have insurance, you don't have incentives to deal with the insured against event. I think the worry about moral hazard has been greatly exaggerated for two reasons. First, more broadly in the political moral hazard, no country would put themselves through what the Southern European countries have put themselves through just to collect a little bit more deposit insurance. You know, it's just inconceivable to somebody say, well, I'm going to let my people have 25% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, so I can get a few $1 billion in deposit insurance. It just doesn't ring true. But secondly, today there is a role for supervision. I mean, that's the role of supervision, and to say, okay, you have to make good loans. But one of the important things to realize, you know, Italy right now is going through a lot of worries about their banking system. It is not, you know, some of the banks may have made bad loans, but if you have an economy that's been in stagnation for 6, 7, 8 years, it is hard not to have loans go bad. You know, that is, if the economy is bad, your banking system will wind up bad. And so that's what you're dealing with in Europe today. And I think it's going to get worse. That's one of the reasons why why I think there's a certain element of urgency that there is a cumulative effect going on, that the longer the stagnation goes on, the more banks that are going to be in trouble. And then all these kinds of controversies, what do we do with the banks, rise to the surface.
Yeah, but that really means that if you're going to talk to a German bank, for example, you would tell them you just have to live with the consequences of the Eurozone, actually keep a burden on your shoulders which could save banks in Italy, Spain, or Greece.
Right now, I would, if I were in these countries, I'd be worrying about having to bail out Deutsche Bank.
Good point. Yeah. One thing you didn't mention in your summary is the ECB and the monetary policy of the European Central Bank. So what do you think about this policy of flooding markets with cheap money, which was also the case in the US and still is? It's also the case in other countries like Japan. So do you think this is the right way to deal with the current kind of stagnation and low inflation we have?
No. The right way is fiscal expansion. But these monetary authorities are facing, to different degrees in different countries, the problem of austerity. In the United States, we have a milder form of austerity than Europe does, but we have just in the United States, about 500,000 fewer people working in the public sector than we did before the crisis. With normal expansion, we'd have something like 2 million more. So we have austerity. You have austerity. So the right policy, and central bankers in Europe and the United States have said it very forcefully, that monetary policy has really come to the end of its ability to stimulate the economy. So they've been very clear. Look at, if you don't do your job with fiscal policy, with stimulation, if you continue to have this kind of austerity that's strangling our economy, we have to fulfill our mission. In Europe, the mission, I think, is wrongly constructed about deflation, inflation, but they say we're supposed to stop, stop deflation, and the constraint, the economies are so weak that we're facing deflation. So we have to do what we can, but really you should be doing what you should be doing to the fiscal authorities. That's been their central message, and it's the same thing in the United States. Now, this is where the models that economists have used, both the United States and Europe, have tended to go wrong. They focused too much just on the interest rate, as if that was the only way you regulate the economy, regulate monetary. So the idea is, if we lower the interest rate, that leads to an expansion of the economy. Well, we lowered interest rates from 5% to 0, and it had almost no effect.
Negative interest rate.
And now they say, well, if we go from 0 to -1, that's going to be a miracle.
Yeah.
I think that's foolish. I don't think it's going to stimulate the economy very much.
So have we passed? Sorry, go ahead.
And there's some evidence that, at least in some cases, it actually may have a negative effect. And the reason is, it goes back to the theory of banking, that if negative interest rates, if they're not very carefully structured, in some countries, some central banks, I know Japan has tried very hard, I can't tell you whether it actually succeeded. If you don't structure the negative interest rates very carefully, you decapitalize the banks. And that, of course, as you decapitalize the banks, that means they can do less lending, and that means the economy is weaker. So it's not the interest rate that's the key variable, it's the actual flow of credit to, say, small and medium-sized enterprises.
Do you think that's happening right now in Europe with the negative interest rate? So have we passed the point where monetary policy does any good?
I think you're at the point where the evidence that it's doing good is becoming scarcer and scarcer. I think I would be very skeptical that these negative interest rates would actually succeed in having much of a stimulus, and so far it hasn't had much of an effect. I've seen some studies that looked at some of the countries where it's done, where the effects have been negative. But that's an area where economists are not yet agreed what the evidence is, but there's no evidence that it has a strong effect. I think that's pretty clear.
I have one question regarding your reform proposals, so to say. So you are actually in favor of more flexibility, so different kind of flexibility within the Eurozone. The question is, how do you get from point A to B? So how do you manage this transition to a different kind of Eurozone you have in mind?
Yeah, with difficulty. So what I try to do in the book is to try to show how you can reduce some of those costs. And this is where, there is this idea of an electronic banking system, because if you have an electronic banking system, it's easier to control capital flows. You can prevent runs on the banking systems. You can prevent capital outflows. And those are among the major problems in dealing with the transition. So that's why I think, and we're almost there, in countries like in many of the European countries, they're already 95% towards an electronic payments mechanism. And so one of the points is that, you know, one should really finish the job, because then you have a framework that allows for a much easier transition than otherwise would be the case. The other important, you know, I talk about amicable divorce. One of the hardest things, and some people say, you know, there's no such thing as an amicable divorce, but one of the hardest things is that depending on how the move into a more flexible euro occurs, some countries may not be able to pay back all that they owe, and there will have to be debt restructuring. And debt restructuring has been part of capitalism since the beginning, but sometimes it can be very litigious. Inside our countries, like in the United States, we have something called Chapter 11, where we recognize how important it is for those restructurings to be done expeditiously to keep jobs, to keep businesses in place. Internationally, we don't have that kind of smooth kind of transition, but Europe, recognizing this, could try to create a framework within Europe that would allow for this restructuring to be done in, you might say, in an expedited way, realizing that, you know, this is an unusual circumstance, and therefore it's really important for this to be done smoothly.
I would like to broaden the picture a little bit and come to other economic areas as well. So I wonder, are the problems we are talking about just part of bigger problems where we have oversized financial markets, oversized financial system, which is almost detached from the real economy? So we have, I already talked about Japan, we have hidden debt in China. Even in the US, the national debt is almost $20 trillion. So the debate we had after 2008, after the financial crisis, that we have a financial sector which is actually in exuberance, detached from the real economy. Is this still the case, you think?
Yes, I mean, I don't think we've really fully fixed the financial system. But, you know, and you say it's the detachment from the real sector. And one of my criticisms of a lot of the financial sector reforms is it's actually quite remarkable. Most of the discussion has been focused on how do we prevent the financial system from imposing harms, excessive risk-taking, market manipulation, insider trading, predatory lending. You know, I could go on, market manipulation. These are the things. But we haven't had as much discussion as we ought to, which is how do we make sure that the financial system actually does what it's supposed to, which is like lend to small and medium-sized enterprises. So to me, that's really at the center of the problem, that it's not the magnitude of the debt, it's really what you know, it creates CDSs, it creates these gambles on various things, but it's not actually providing credit to, say, small and medium-sized enterprises, which for much of Europe are really the heart of the economy. And the data that I've seen for much of Europe, you know, if you look at the level of SME lending, it's down actually significantly from what it was before the crisis.
Do you think the financial system overall is more stable today than it was, let's say, 2008, 2009, so at the peak of the crisis?
You probably need to qualify. Some parts of the financial system are more stable.
Like?
United States.
Okay.
You know, the banking authorities in Europe gave a clean health to the European banking system 3 weeks before one of the major banks went bankrupt. So what I'm afraid of is you're going to be asking me to give a clean bill of health to a banking system a few days before it goes belly up. So no, but the United States has done a lot more recapitalization of the banks than I think Europe has done. And that has put our banks on a sounder basis. And we've made a big effort to increase capital requirements. There's a lot of resistance, and I don't think they're still high enough. But we've moved a long way in that direction with a lot of yelling and screaming.
Yeah. You said the financial system, the banks, they don't do their job. They're not providing credit to the small and medium-sized enterprises. So is there an alternate model of a financial system which could do a better job? Should we look, how should we change the business model of our banks to do those?
Yeah, there are two things I think that are important. One is to actually encourage banks to focus on banking. That sounds like a radical
How
idea.
do we do that? Just tell them? Or?
Well, no. By not allowing them to do so many other things. You know, if they couldn't make money by monopoly control of the payment mechanism, where in the United States, I don't know the numbers here, but in the United States, they make, you know, $30–40 billion a year out of credit card fees and debit card fees. You know, which the cost of moving electrons from to tell the bank, I just bought something, transfer money from my account to the merchant account, is a fraction of a penny. And they charge the merchant 1%, 2%, 3%. I mean, it's unconscionable, their monopoly power. The profits they make out of credit default swaps and these derivatives. So if you restrain them from making profits in these other ways, I have confidence that they'll figure out how to make, you know, how to make money by going back to their core function, which is lending, going back to being banks. So I think that's one of the most important steps. The second thing is, I think it's important to have some reforms in, you might say, in the corporate governance of banks. The way, and this is not only of banks, but of the corporate sector as a whole, and this is an area where I think America's firms are on weaker grounds than some of Germany's. We've encouraged our firms, and our banks included them, to be very short-sighted, to look at the quarterly returns. And when you're looking at quarterly returns, you get the kind of things that you saw in the Wells Fargo incident, where you encourage, you know, you say, open up accounts. Well, don't bother asking the customer whether he wants to have an account open up. Just open it up, and you know, he'll never notice it. And then start charging him for the account that you opened up in his name. And maybe he won't even remember whether he did it. So that's how you get the Wells Fargo kinds of incident. But you know, you have Goldman Sachs going and testifying. They had a Goldman Sachs testifying. You know, banks used to pride themselves on trust. And the head of Goldman Sachs testified to Congress. He said, anybody that trusts us is a fool. You know, caveat emptor. You know, these are grown-ups. They should know that we're out to skin them. He didn't quite say it that forcefully, but that was that was the... So I think this corporate culture has to be changed, and the incentive structures that lead to that kind of behavior. Yeah.
You're an American, and we're here at the American Academy, so we have to talk about the US election a bit, please. Populism and anti-establishment protests are not only restricted to Europe. You already mentioned a couple of them. There's a big upheaval also in the US as well. We had Brexit, which was also a sign of mixed reasons for the vote we had in Britain. And even if I read through your arguments, not knowing that you are Joe Stiglitz, the liberal, you could easily say this is some of his critics are also being placed on the right or on the left-hand side. They are common, at least in a few arguments of them. So what's really going on with this forgotten and angry people who are actually now in the US looking for a different kind of direction, or what could it be?
Well, I mean, first, they are unhappy because they should be unhappy. Things have not gone very well for a very large swath of America. Basically, the bottom 90% of America has had has had stagnant income for the last third of a century. And just to, the median income of a full-time male worker, and it's really hard to be full-time, but if you can get a full-time job, the median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 42 years ago. The real wages at the bottom are roughly the same as they were 60 years ago. That's our minimum wage. And that's why we need an increase in our minimum wage. Life expectancy among males in this middle-age, middle cohort is actually declining significantly, and mostly from social diseases like alcoholism, drugs, suicide. The only time I ever saw anything like this was when I was at the World Bank and we started seeing data coming in from Russia after the collapse of the Iron Curtain, and their incomes were going down by a third, and we thought maybe our numbers were wrong. And then when we started getting demographic data saying their life expectancy was going down, it was confirming the bad picture. And that's what's true in the United States. These results on life expectancy that just came out in December from Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton just got the Nobel Prize this December. Were really totally disturbing to everybody in the country, including President Obama. We just really said something is not going well in the country, and then the question is what has gone wrong? A big debate about what are the factors, but what clearly they perceive was that there were a whole set of changes in the rules of the game, from supply side economics, globalization, financial market liberalization, all of which said, oh yes, you're not, the top is going to do better, but trickle down economics, don't worry, you're going to do well too. Everybody's going to benefit. Some may benefit more. Don't be, this is not the politics of envy. You're going to get better off. But the reality is, it's not been true. And then the critical moment, I think, was the 2008 financial crisis, because that was the moment where they saw the governments coming in, as I told the story, to help the banks, paying very little attention to, millions of Americans really lost their homes, their jobs, and the government only paid attention to the bankers, or seemed to. And the theory was, oh, don't worry, if we save the bankers, you'll benefit. They said, where? When? And so the view now is, not only are they not well off, they believe the system is rigged, and they believe the government can't be trusted to fix it. Yeah. And that leads to that kind of anger, and willingness to throw in a hand grenade into the system and say it can't be worse.
What's the right answer to that? I mean, is it, as one candidate suggests, building walls, closing borders, stopping trade agreements? You are also in favor for not signing...
bad trade agreements.
Exactly.
For good trade agreements. And I'm against having a trade war or any other kind of war. And, the trouble is that I'm afraid that Trump will actually, we know there'll be a trade war, and we worry about other forms of war that he could get us into. The problem isn't, as he's characterized it, that our negotiators didn't do a good job negotiating. The real problem was too much of that trade agenda was seized by corporate interest for the corporate interest, and not for the interest of ordinary citizens. And just to give you an example, we don't know what TTIP is like, because it's still under negotiation, but we know what TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the one thing you have to understand about trade agreements is they always have a name the opposite of what they are. So if they're called a partnership, that means the US government dictated it. And if it's called a free trade agreement, it means it's a managed trade agreement. And this is, of course, a managed, it's not a free trade agreement. When we say a managed trade agreement, you know, a free trade agreement would be 3 pages long. We get rid of our tariffs, you get rid of yours. We get rid of our non-tariff barriers, you get rid of yours. We get rid of our subsidies, you get rid of yours. This TPP is 6,000 pages long. And we have a law that requires that the government do an estimate of what the effect of the trade agreement will be on GDP. So this trade agreement, Champion is the largest trade agreement ever, 40% of global economy. The net effect on the US economy from the US government economist, okay, optimistic, is after 15 or 20 years, 0.15% of GDP. And independent estimates by like Tufts University have it more optimistic 0. So this is not about trade, it's about something else.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open it up for questions now. And maybe we can start right here on the left side.
Thank you. I'm Peter.
Yeah, just state your name and make it really a question and not a second speech.
Yes, I will make it a very specific question. I'm the founder of Transparency International. Joe, it's wonderful to have you here, and I hope your words fall on open ears. I have a question about the debt crisis, the euro crisis, where I just heard again a question asked to you whether the Greeks, for instance, or the Italians or the Spanish shouldn't do their homework before they can count on the support of the rich countries. You probably saw the program of Mr. Varoufakis when he came to the last spring meeting and presented this, for instance, at the Brookings Institute. When he came with the same program here to the Troika, he was told by everybody that the Greeks are not proposing anything, that in the media always said, let them do their homework, which is one of the clauses which I really hate in this context. Have you seen their program, and did you have the feeling that this made sense at the time, made more sense than the austerity and the programs which were imposed on them?
Yeah, I can't now recall all the details, but I did at the time look at many aspects. And yes, I thought it was a good program. He was actually very thoughtful of thinking through both the macro and the structural reforms, the microeconomic reforms. He's actually quite a good economist. And I think, I understand that not everybody may like his style, but you shouldn't make a country suffer because you don't like somebody's style. You should be able to see through that. You know, if he doesn't wear a tie, and finance ministers normally wear tie, not a big thing. So as I say, I think think his program was better than a program focusing on whether you should have 4-day or 10-day old milk to be classified. So I think they had done their homework.
Okay. Next question, here in the front.
Leslie Collett. I was the Financial Times correspondent in Berlin and Eastern Europe for many years. I wanted to ask you, you spoke of the amicable divorce being unlikely. What about Brexit now? Do you think the UK will be able to muddle on, or will it be a success? Or what do you think the outlook will be?
Yeah. I think, obviously, some elements of this are political as well as, no one knows how the two sides are going to negotiate. There are a couple points that I'd like to make. The first is that to me, the response of Juncker right after, and that reflects a mood of a lot of people, is that we will be very tough in bargaining because we don't want anybody else to leave. And I thought that was striking, at least as an outsider, because you would have hoped that Europe, the EU, offers something positive that people would want to belong. And that to say that the only way that we can keep people joined together is by fear. Fear of what happened if they leave. That was such a negative message. You know, he could have said, you know, we have to convince people better about the virtues, the benefits of the EU. We could have said, we have to make sure that the EU works better together. His message was all about fear. From the economic point of view, on the goods side, the merchant, you know, on the trade in goods, the average tariffs in the WTO goods that the UK sells to Europe are, so you think about the worst case scenarios where you would go back to a WTO scenario, would be 5%. I mean, assuming that you decide not to treat UK worse than you treat Zimbabwe or some other country. The change in the exchange rate right after was 11%, and the change in the exchange rate now is again. So that change in exchange rate swamps the tariffs. And that makes the point that was a big point of my whole talk. Exchange rate adjustments are important. And so that is actually a larger effect on the trade of goods than the tariffs. Now, in the case of some of the others in the service sectors, those are more complicated because there's a whole set of regulations and that's not clear where that will go. But I think it's probably in the interest of both parties to reach a kind of agreement that where the net effect will be not that negative. And clearly the market perception in terms of is that it isn't going to be that negative on either side of the channel.
There were questions in the back. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir, for this talk. Manfred Nitsch, I'm an emeritus professor of economics here at Freie Universität and one of this Keynesian, monetary Keynesian tribe. So I want to push you a little bit further, even with your debt restructuring, perhaps. So it's an old Keynesian preoccupation, what to do with surplus countries and what kind of discipline to put on the surplus countries. And wouldn't be debt restructuring in a more generalized sense, not only for Greece, but in general terms, one of the way outs to discipline creditors who build up claims and only lose them in Lehman crises or in other types of crises and turn the debtor into a debtor peonage without really considering debt restructuring and debt forgiveness and insolvency on a little bit broader scale even than what you mentioned?
Yeah, so I think debt restructuring is important. And it's interesting that, you know, to put this back into the global context, the worst lending practices occurred in the United States after the United States changed its bankruptcy law to make it more difficult to have debt restructuring. It was precisely the Republicans wanted to make it debt restructuring more difficult. That's what led to bad lending, the worst lending practices, and it really reinforces your point. There's one more in terms of the question you asked me before about what to do about the surplus. Keynes actually was worried about surpluses because he realized that if some countries are producing more than they're consuming, in a world in which there is a deficiency of aggregate demand, it imposes an externality on others. It weakens the global economy. So he said that there ought to be a tax on surpluses to discourage countries from having surpluses. And that, I think, is an idea that Europe ought to revisit. And
put it mildly. All right. Herr Rucker, hier vorne in der.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the inspiring thoughts. I'd like to come back to fiscal expansion and actually ask the question, what should make Germany really confident about the fact that it would work? Based on the experience we've had in this country, seeing the debt level going up from, say, 20% of GDP in the 70s to now 80% after the financial crisis, seeing long planning cycles, getting to actually full capacity, and then maybe in the end also seeing what actually our experience with public investment is, in particular here in Berlin. It's not always just overwhelmingly positive, so looking at the airport, for example. So I'm just wondering, to what extent can we be sure that indeed fiscal expansion would not only help this country but also other countries, or would it rather go to a situation that Kenneth Rogoff described as being completely over-indebted and really even taking more time to get out of the mess and getting back to a more sustainable growth path?
Yeah, so first, I mean, you can't be sure that investment is going to be well spent, but that's true in both the public and the private sector. You look at how our banks lent money and how the money was spent in the private sector. You know, I don't think there's ever been a bigger misallocation of resources than by our private banks in the United States. So does that mean that the result of that is people should give up investing and saving because sometimes people make mistakes? No, I don't think that's an alternative. So the response is, how do we make sure that there's a better job of investing well? We've looked at when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we looked at the returns to government investments in infrastructure, investments in technology, and the returns to government investments were far higher than any returns in the private sector. So we felt very confident. These are average, and let me make it clear that there are some good projects and some bad projects, and that's true in the private sector. And if, there's a theory that if you only have good projects, you aren't taking enough risk. Because, good risk taking means that you have some things that win and some things that lose. But on average, the data was very clear that our investment projects had higher returns than investment projects in the private sector. So, I feel confident that Germany is even better at managing the public sector than Trump.
Very good. Right. We have time for one more question. I think the gentleman in the back there. Yeah. No, it's you. And that's the last one for tonight.
Detlef Prinz, University of Potsdam. You talked about moral hazard. Let's rerun history with the euro. How would an ideal and long-term sustainable Europe governance system could have looked like? And B, why wasn't it politically and economically feasible? That would be a useful benchmark to judge against.
Well, there are many aspects of this governance issue, and I think when economists talked about what would make a single currency work, they focused on the economic conditions like migration of labor. I talked about a common deposit insurance so capital wouldn't flow out of the weaker countries and go into the stronger countries. But there's another aspect that I think, as I've looked at the experience of the euro, that struck me is political convergence, political similarity. Because if you have a group of countries trying to share a common currency, which is a high degree of economic integration, you are going to wind up making many decisions together. And if you have very different views about what makes for good economic policy, If one group of countries thinks that certain policies are good and the other think that those same policies are bad, you're going to have a lot of trouble of getting congruence about and consistency in policies over time. So I've increasingly come to the view that more attention should have been given to this issue of economic governance and the issue of whether there's enough political homogeneity, political, it's not just solidarity, but do they see the world in enough of a similar way? Not, within any country, the people see the world in different ways, but is it similar enough that a single currency could work? You can't write down in the rules of any system, I think, all contingencies that you're going to have to deal with. And that's why a system that is so-called rule-based is a framework, but you are still going to have to make decisions. You're going to have to interpret what those rules mean. You're going to have to say, when we say percentage of GDP, do we mean, how do we measure GDP? Do we include capital expenditures or not capital expenditures? I mean, there are 1,000 definitions that go into that, and over time, those words are going to change in meaning, and you're going to have to interpret them. And so, inevitably, policy is going to be part of running a single currency. And you're going to have to wind up making common policy decisions. And if there are too big a divergence in the views about what is good policy, then it's going to be very hard to make everybody happy. Final point is that when you create, the one thing that citizens care a lot about is how their economy performs. If you tell ordinary voters that they have no say over their economy, they're going to be particularly unhappy. And if you create an economic framework that delegates all important economic decision-making to non-elected bodies, you're going to have a lot of unhappiness. So that means that if you are going to have a degree of integration where you are going to have really important policy decisions being made collectively, you have to think about how do you get some more degree of democratic accountability, including, I think, more direct accountability, not only the indirect way through governments. So one or two orders removed, I think there has to be at least a higher degree of a sense of direct accountability.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much. A special round of applause for Stiglitz. And I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Joseph Stiglitz, for this. I was tempted to say inspiring, but this fascinating tour de force through history and the various economic models that you presented, and it's indeed very difficult to make everybody happy. And you've made it very clear that there is no invisible hand that will help us sort out the euro crisis, I take it. But, if I may be allowed this metaphor, there were many invisible hands active scenes, and they prepared for us food and drink. I know, I had to do it. To continue, if you like, this fascinating debate about how we solve, if you like, a global crisis. And I understand that you'll be around to answer questions we always wanted to ask you. And there's a table over there in which you can take a look at his most recent book publications, not the difficult mathematical papers, but the readable, interesting, fascinating, controversial books. They're all out there. And I invite you now for drinks and nibblies around the corner. Mix, mingle, talk, speak, and make the most of Joseph Stiglitz here tonight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.